Switching in focus now from phosphorus through to nitrogen, and this particular presentation is all about late application of nitrogen wheat for protein accumulation, and the question really is it worth it? Nearly everyone here would have been involved in the harvests in 2011 and 2012, where pretty much across most of northwest New South Wales and into southern Queensland we had very low proteins in our delivered wheat, generally with good yields. Although it was a pretty regional effect, EGA Gregory was a variety that was frequently seen as a culprit, and with the trial data from the last couple of years, it's pretty much likely that some top's going to give us the same sort of results, that high yield, low delivered protein situation. Not surprisingly, the growers and advisors that we're working with saw a very big need, very big interest in really getting some hard data on the potential and the benefits of late N application. The approach in this part of the project was a pretty simple one. We just had one product, urea, one rate, 40 units of N per hectare, and in all cases we were applying it in addition to what the grower and their advisor had decided was the appropriate level of N for the water they had and their yield potential. So first thing is, we weren't going into highly deficient situations. The key parts here were we were looking at methods and timing. As you can see up there on the slide, there were 3 different methods. This is all with straight urea. We either spread it, a urea solution going through a stream bar, or that same solution going through a conventional nozzle, what I've described as a foliar approach. You can see the number of trials that were involved, so there are a large number over the 2 years, and in each of those trials there were between 4 and 5 different application timings. So at every one of those application timings there was spread urea, stream bar and foliar approaches. A couple of comments in terms of those seasons. No surprise, 2012, 2013, the springs have been generally dry with very few rain events. Average rainfall in the order of 25 to 35 mils across those sites in the 2 years. The highest we received was up at Brookstead last year, was about 65 mils. So they weren't ideal seasons in terms of trying to get good incorporation with rain. And as it shows at the bottom of that slide, very different seasons in terms of protein. 2012 was one of those years where we were getting very low protein levels across the whole region, and we saw exactly the same in these trials, averaging only 10%. Last year, with a totally different sort of finish, we're up around 13% on average. In terms of the data, this first one is showing the methods that were used and the results. We're looking here at the percentage protein. Those 3 columns represent about 400 different data sets behind them, so there's a huge amount of data that's been put together. And the key thing you can see here is when we applied that same amount of nitrogen through a conventional nozzle, a foliar application, we were getting a significant improvement in protein compared to either the stream bar or the same amount spread. Now that's no great surprise given a dry season, particularly with the spread urea. The dotted line or the broken line there is what would have happened without any additional nitrogen. And what you can see fairly clearly, we weren't getting a response to the spread urea or the stream bar in those trials in 2012. 2013, obviously those proteins have jumped up dramatically, but what you can see across all those trials is very much the same level of response or the same sort of response. Again, a significant benefit or a significant increase in protein going through a foliar type application, and very little difference or no significant difference between the spread and the stream bar. We haven't got time today, it's in the paper, the timing differences between the applications were certainly much less clear in both seasons. After 2012, we were concerned when we had such a dry spring, we might have the same in 2013, which unfortunately came about to be fairly true. We wanted to make sure that we covered our bases somewhat and had at least one or perhaps two irrigated sites. We had one at the PBI at Narrabri, which was a supplementary irrigation site, and essentially looking at the results, it behaved much more like a dryland situation. And so we only had one good full irrigation site co-located with some of Alan Peake's work at Brookstead on the Downs. That particular site, he was budgeting on a yield between 6.5 and 7 tonnes per hectare and had applied nitrogen to that level. Unfortunately, where our trial was, we're only achieving about 5.25 tonnes per hectare. So there's the first concern. Our background N levels were fairly high. But in terms of irrigations, there are 8 different irrigations through the season, including 5 lots of 30 mils during the periods when we're applying the nitrogen. In addition, we had another 40 mils roughly of rain during head emergence. So it was a site that was pretty well unlimited in terms of that extra water. What did we see? On the left-hand side shows the 3 methods, and I think most of you had picked up there's a striking resemblance between the result there and what we've seen across all 11 sites in the 2 years. Wasn't significant at this site, but again, the foliar treatment was the one that was probably giving us an extra 0.2 or 0.3% protein. On the right-hand side shows the 4 timings, and this was probably the trial that showed the most classic timing differences, and this would fall in line with a lot of overseas literature, which would suggest that if you're going to try this sort of approach, going just pre-flowering to shortly post-flowering, or perhaps the early milk stage, is most likely to be the sweet spot in terms of trying to get the most nitrogen into that protein accumulation. So far, that was all about those late nitrogen applications. We also have been looking at what sort of benefit we got from earlier applications of spread urea in comparison. Again, there's more information in your paper, or in the paper. This is just looking at the series of trials in 2013. All 5 sites had spread urea applied at planting, incorporated by sowing, which is that first column. Here was where it was split between planting and growth stage 30, and here's where it was all applied and spread at growth stage 30 and just incorporated by rainfall. What you can see in terms of spreading urea, no great surprise here. If you're going to do it as early in the season as possible. And what we're seeing even in terms of a protein response is we're getting a much better response from that nitrogen put down at planting than we were with any of those late applications. How did that compare to the best of our foliar treatments? In 2012, the early application or the planting application was the best of the lot. In 2013, we did achieve just slightly better with those foliar approaches, but with a much higher risk. Economics. Unfortunately, although we got significant responses, you could all pick, we're only getting about an average 0.3, 0.4% of a protein unit over those trials. We did not get a net economic benefit from any treatment in any of the 11 trials. Under the conditions we experienced over the last couple of years, the highest grain nitrogen yield, and that's yield by protein level, in terms of what we got back from those 40 units, was about 30 to 35%. So we were putting on 40 units, which was up at the highest level of what we could apply. At best, we're only getting about 15 units back in terms of protein. The mean across all those trials was much more like 15 to 20%. So our recovery wasn't great. On that basis, we really needed about a $20 to $40 per tonne difference in grain price to make this work. Now, most of you who've been farming for a long period of time, that probably happens 2 years in 10, maybe a little bit more frequently. But to make this work, you also need situations where a 0.5% or a 1% protein gain will help to drive you into the next grade class. Because if you're starting at 8.5% protein and you increase it by 1%, you probably don't get much more back for your 9.5% protein grain. If, however, we can improve those recoveries up to 40 or 60%, premiums of only $10 to $20 per tonne probably start coming into the reckoning in terms of making it economic. Conclusions: if you are going to try a late application, no surprises here. Using a conventional nozzle or a foliar approach is the only way to try it. If you're using spread or stream bar urea, obviously much earlier in the season. That said, we certainly weren't able to make it economic. To make it work, we need to increase that grain recovery to greater than 50%. We need grain price differentials of probably $20 per tonne or more. And the third tricky one to get right is we need to be able to identify those situations where that 0.5% or 1% gain is likely to get us into a next protein class. And finally, in terms of application of that extra N early in the crop, certainly in most of our dryland situations would have been a much lower risk. Pretty easy one to explain there. If we're getting it on early, we've got potential for a yield benefit from that nitrogen in tandem with the protein benefits we're seeing. If we're leaving it to that really late application timing, we've basically eliminated any chance of getting a yield benefit, and we've got all our eggs in the one basket in terms of getting a protein response. Leave it there, Jack.